I now have the pleasure of introducing another distinguished speaker, Professor Graham MacGregor. Professor MacGregor is the professor of cardiovascular medicine. He comes from London, the United Kingdom. He chairs the Blood Pressure Association. He was past president of the British Hypertension Society. And I think more importantly, he is the founder and the leader of CASH. And CASH is the Consensus Action on Salt and Health. And Professor MacGregor actually led the successful national experience of salt reduction in the United Kingdom. So, Graham, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure, and I'd like to thank all of the organisers for inviting me, and ladies and gentlemen, Chairman, great pleasure for me to talk to you. What I want to see is some action from you, because without action, nothing's going to happen. All of us in this room are going to die and suffer before we die, and most of us are going to die and suffer from cardiovascular disease, that's strokes, heart attacks, and heart failure. Those diseases are preventable. You can prevent them in yourself and in your countries. So please, when you go back, do something. Why are we interested in salt? Well, it's the major cause of raised blood pressure, and secondly, it's incredibly cheap in these difficult economic times to reduce it, because we can get the food industry to do it in many countries, and that costs you in government nothing. Blood pressure, as you've heard, is the biggest cause of death in the world, And of course, the level of blood pressure, it isn't just at 140. Most of you may think, I'm all right, my blood pressure's less than 140 systolic. But look at 120 to 140, the risk increases threefold of a stroke and a heart attack. That's 80% of the population in Saudi Arabia at risk from their blood pressure. So we must adopt population measures to reduce blood pressure. It's no good just treating it, which is very beneficial. We must shift the whole population down. This is what you die from, a cerebral hemorrhage, the direct effects of blood pressure, and of course atherosclerosis. All of us are developing atherosclerosis. You'll see the atheromatous plaque, the ulcerated plaque, and the thing that kills you, the fissured plaque that clots. That's the cause of heart attacks, the commonest cause of death in the world. And of course, blood pressure, cholesterol, and smoking account for 80% of all patients who die from atherosclerosis. Why do we eat so much salt? It was a preservative. It was of great importance historically, great religious importance. It's now used as a taste enhancer by the food industry for food that has no taste. And 80% of the salt in most developed countries comes from the food industry. Of course, in many other countries and some in this region, most of it is added, and that requires a different policy. The evidence is overwhelming, I'm not going to go into that relates salt to blood pressure. And we can work out from trials that if we reduce salt intake by 5 to 6 grams, we'd reduce strokes by 1/4 and heart attacks and heart failure by 20%, 1/5. And that would save 2.5 million deaths a year. From the meta-analysis of outcome trials, a very small reduction, only 2 grams, probably in Saudi Arabia, salt intake's 10 to 12 grams. So you're talking about a 20 to 15% reduction would reduce cardiovascular events by 20%. So salt intake obviously must be reduced. It's also important in stomach cancer and osteoporosis as well. How do we do it? Well, we've got to measure salt intake, but you don't necessarily need to do that because we know it's high. We've got to get the sources of salt in the diet in each country, and then we've got to work out a strategic plan as to how to do it. And it's either focused on added salt by the consumer or salt put in by the food industry. You need a 50% reduction in both of those. And the food industry is easy. We set targets for each food group and get them to do it. In the UK, we've done that on a voluntary policy, so has Finland. In South Africa, they're now regulating the food industry. This is the plan for the UK. I'll very briefly show you what happened in the UK. You see, salt intake was 9.5, target of 6 grams, 40% reduction needed by the public, but only very small amounts are added by the public or the consumers, and most of the reduction comes from the food industry. We could have voluntary, regulatory, or legislative things, or salt tax, but whatever you do, you need to set targets for each food group. And the point about this policy is that we're getting the food industry to do this. Everyone in the UK's salt intake's fallen in the last 7 years. Most of the consumers don't even know that the bread has been reduced by 30%, cereals have been reduced by 40%, ready-prepared meals have been reduced by 40%. Because it's been done slowly, no one notices, and everyone has a reduction. And that is brilliant for public health, because every single person has had a fall in salt intake. We're not asking the population to go out and select foods. We don't want them to do that, much as we would like to, but we know it doesn't work. We're reducing it slowly, and you can do the same for sugar, and you can do the same for saturated fat. Slowly reduce it without the public knowing. They have to set targets. I won't go into this for each food group, rather tedious, sorry. And of course, there are differences between a voluntary and regulatory system, and I'm not going to go into those for the sake of time, but obviously a regulatory system is better, but it's difficult for governments to do. And this is the voluntary system, the stick and carrot. It's like getting a donkey to move. You hit the food industry with a stick, and you give them a carrot at the same time, and that gets them to move. This is some of the publicity we've had in the UK to get this policy going, and you need to have it in your own countries, showing to the public, the other officials in the government and to the food industry that salt is important in putting our blood pressure and is killing us. And here's a press release about salads sold by supermarkets which have a lot of added salt in, because the ingredients, salad of course doesn't have salt in it, but all the ingredients you put in, the bacon, the cheese, the ham, the bits of bread, bring it up to very high amounts. And you can see when the caricature for the paper starts doing that, you know you're winning the battle. So we have been successful in the UK, and we're still reducing salt. We've reduced it by 15% in the last 6 years. Much slower than we would like, but that has already reduced strokes and heart attacks by 18,000 events a year, 9,000 of which are fatal. That's more than all of the people who die in road traffic accidents. In fact, twice the number of people who die in road traffic accidents in the UK. And this is just an example. This is a reduction of bread. The average level of salt's come down in bread in the UK. And no taste problems, no reduction in sales, and we think the salt target should be reached by around 2016, but we'll go below that. We now have the lowest salt intake of any country in the world. Cost-effective thing, which is very important for you, £5 million a year was spent on the campaign, and healthcare savings have been 1.5 billion. So that's for £1 spent, you save 300. Name me a single public health policy that's as cost-effective as that. Very attractive to all of you to institute this, because it doesn't cost very much. Look at this. This is in developing and middle-income countries, a paper looking at the costs of reducing salt against cigarettes. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't reduce cigarettes, and I agree entirely with my colleague Douglas that we must do something about that as well. But look, salt is actually more effective at a lower cost in developing and middle-income countries. These are our world action groups all over the world, and action is taking place in many countries in the world to reduce salt, while the WHO and the WHA and others go on talking forever about what they're doing. What we want is action now, action from you. You're able to do it, so let's see salt intake being reduced. South Africa has set a very good example as a developing country. The Minister of Health, along with the Ministry of Trade and other accepted ministers, have decided to regulate the food industry and have set targets that the food companies have to stick to. So salt intake will fall, and that has been aimed particularly at the black population in South Africa, who are particularly sensitive to salt and suffer tremendously from the effects of blood pressure. There's no action, as far as we can see, being taken in the Arab world and Middle East, and it's time now you did something about it. You have a tremendous problem with blood pressure, diabetes, lipids, and really you need to do something now, and salt is the easiest thing to do. And I would implore you to really go back to your countries now, and the two priorities for action should be tobacco and salt reduction, because they're very easy to implement and very cost effective. Thank you very much.